So far, we've learned what capital gains are, how to compute capital gains tax, and how to figure out the basis of a capital asset. But we really haven't gone into how capital gains are reported on a tax return. That's what this video is all about. I'm the Tax Geek, back with more of your taxes, oversimplified. To start out, let's look at the reporting document that you're issued when you sell a capital asset at either a gain or a loss, the 1099-B. This is the IRS version of the form, but most of the time, this information is presented on a consolidated brokerage statement. As long as the brokerage statement shows the same information as the official form, it's an acceptable substitute. We'll examine brokerage statements in detail in another video. We're not going to look at all the boxes on this form, just the ones that are relevant to most tax-paying investors. The left side of the form has the usual identifying information for the payer and recipient. At the top of the form is the applicable checkbox, which gives a code for the type of transaction. We'll examine what those codes are a bit later. Box 1 shows the details of the transaction, describing the property that was sold, the dates the property was acquired and then sold, how much money was received when the property was sold, and for all covered securities, the cost or other basis of the asset that was sold. For non-covered securities, box 1E is often blank. If you're unfamiliar with any of these terms, I urge you to click on the playlist above to understand the basics of capital gains. Box 2 indicates whether the gain was short-term or long-term. To review, long-term gains are gains on the sales of assets held for at least 1 year. You can also figure out whether a gain was short or long-term by looking at boxes 1B and 1C. All security sales are considered to be covered unless box 5 is checked indicating a non-covered security. And if box 12 is checked, the payer's calculation of basis was reported to the IRS. For covered securities, this box is always checked. Capital asset sales are first reported on Form 8949. You may have up to 3 Forms 8949 with your tax return. You need one 8949 for each of the following types of transactions if you have them: covered securities, non-covered securities, and asset sales that were not reported on Form 1099-B, for example, the sale of real property held for investment. For each type of transaction, short-term sales are listed on page 1 of the form, and long-term sales are listed on page 2. You indicate the type of transaction by checking the appropriate box at the top of each page of the form. There are 6 distinct types of transactions, each with their own codes, as mentioned earlier. They are short-term covered securities, type A, short-term non-covered securities, type B, short-term capital asset sales for which no 1099-B was received, type C. Then long-term covered securities, type D, long-term non-covered securities, type E, and long-term capital asset sales for which no 1099-B was received, type F. The totals from each form are then entered on page 1 of Schedule D. If all of your transactions are either type A or D, and you don't need to adjust the reported basis, a more complicated subject that would be covered in the future, you can skip filling out the forms 8949 and enter the totals of the transactions directly on lines 1A and 8A of Schedule D. A Schedule D has 3 parts on 2 pages. Part 1 shows short-term transaction totals, Part 2 shows long-term transaction totals, and Part 3 summarizes the information from Parts 1 and 2. The figure on line 16 is reported on line 7 of your Form 1040. The rest of Part 3 tells you what worksheets you need to use to calculate your capital gains tax depending on the situation. This is much better illustrated with an example. Meet Martha. She is single and has wage income of $50,000. She also received these 3 Forms 1099-B, plus she sold a piece of land she was holding for investment for $75,000. She paid $35,000 for the land 7 years ago. Let's see how these transactions are reported. Even though all her security sales were for covered securities, she decides to use Form 8949 to report the transactions, since she must report the land sale on Form 8949. Therefore, she needs 2 Forms 8949, one for the stock sales and one for the land sale. First, the security sales. She checks the box at the top of each page indicating the type of transaction. Using the information on the form's 1099-B, she enters the information for the short-term sale on page 1 of the form and the 2 long-term sales on page 2. She totals each column and enters the total on the bottom of each page. Notice that one of the long-term sales resulted in a loss, which is then subtracted from the other stock sales long-term gain. She repeats this process on a fresh Form 8949 to record the land sale. The totals from parts 1 and 2 of each Form 8949 are entered on Schedule D, totaled on lines 7 and 15 of page 1 of Schedule D, and the total of lines 7 and 15 of the form is entered on line 16. This is the amount Martha enters on line 7 of her Form 1040. Since the totals from lines 7 and 15 are both gains, she must complete lines 18, 19, and 20. For oversimplification's sake, we'll skip lines 18 and 19 since neither applies to Martha. Therefore, she checks Yes on line 20 and uses the figure from line 16 of the Schedule D to complete a qualifying dividends and capital gains worksheet. I've covered this worksheet in detail in another video, so here is Martha's completed worksheet, the result of which is entered on line 16 of Martha's 1040. Of course, there are many more details involving Schedule D, some of which will be the subject of future videos. To be notified when these videos are released, all you need to do is subscribe, if you haven't already, and click the bell icon. As always, additional resources and information can be found in the video description. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and share it with anyone who would find it useful. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please leave them in the comment space below. Follow me on Twitter at TaxGeekUSA for announcements of new video releases and occasional tax tips. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon with more of your taxes oversimplified.